Hey guys, so today I wanted to go over how I made this scene, and I would say my process on how I approach this one is a bit different than I usually do, because you might notice that there's a pretty big lack of sci-fi artworks that I've made. It's just because I just never really was gravitated to that genre, but recently I have been. So I wanted to just, experiment with a scene and then slowly build towards like more interesting sci-fi stuff. So this was just more of an experiment. I wouldn't call it like a proper portfolio piece, more of just like an experiment style practice piece, like a study. I also did a quick animation for it. But I'm not gonna like give too much attention to it because it's a very simple animation as you saw, so yeah. But anyways, let's jump right into it. Okay, this time I won't bore you with the same thing that I always do, which is a block out. I quickly just cut out some shapes and figure out an interesting dynamic with the foreground. You can use proportional editing, which you can do by pressing O while in edit mode. I want the view to be just completely blocked out on the right to just create a bit of a tunnel view. And I'm gonna use a curve to create a pipe that leads upwards. That also helps with the composition. I can just duplicate and use the exact same mesh on the other side as well, because when you rotate it like that, it's just impossible to tell it's the same thing. Have one hill in the back, which I'm going to put another outpost in. I'm putting this background hill as a placeholder for now, but we're going to change that later. And now the main place where the building's going to sit is right here, and I can just select the parts and press E to extrude them upwards. I'm going to finalize my lighting already. I prefer to do it early on because if you don't know where the light and dark area is going to play out in your scene, you won't know where to put the details that matter. I wanted to emphasize the slantiness of the scene, so I'm going to have it come in a very diagonal angle, and I'm going to use big spheres as light blockers to block light from certain areas to just give the illusion that there's other things outside the scene which are still blocking light. And as I said before, now I've created my main hill that's going to be in the back. I want it to be a bit imposing, a bit big, but a bit more arid in the way it looks. And I'm pretty happy with the amount of detail I was able to bring into it. And I position it in a way that is pretty imposing and large, as we're using pretty high focal lengths in this. For now, a very simple volume scatter shader onto a big cube just to fill out the area with a bit of mist and dust. Gives us good separation between the foreground and the background. I want the value to be very low because if it's too high, that also looks unrealistic. I'm not trying to go for the hyper, volumetric scenes that I've done in the past. I want just subtle volumetrics for now. Another tip, if you don't want this blocky cube to now just block out your entire scene from view in the viewport, you can just go here and just change it to a wire form. So now in your viewport, it just won't bother you. Now I just kind of want to settle on the shape I want the main building to be. This is just blocking it out with basic cubes and just experiment with the major shapes and how the silhouette forms. This stage is just a lot of experimentation until you settle on something that you're personally happy with, the kind of vibe and mood you want to settle on with the main building. Like making a chimney, they might have some kind of exhaust residue that they want to put out. Or these giant spheres that I love and the people do and stuff. I don't even know what they do, but they just look very cool. So I genuinely wanted to just introduce that into my scene. And the way to give them more detail is just duplicate it and give it a wireframe modifier. And just scale it a little bit so it sits on top of the sphere. I'm going to create these two platforms leading out of the main building, and in the back I want like two antenna-like control tower-esque buildings. And the techniques that I use for these are very simple. I've talked about them before. You can use Control R to add edge loops, and then you can use Control B to bevel those edge loops, and then E to extrude them. Like the actual buttons and technical bits are pretty simple. It's just how you apply them and execute them. Execution is what defines your final product, not just how many buttons you can press to do interesting technical things. Like, just focus on the form and how the things actually look instead of just cramming things with extraordinary amount of detail without any purpose. You can, like for my scene in this, I try not to do overly detailed stuff. I just do intentional detail in certain places and then just leave other places just completely empty and barren. This time I wanted to do a bit of an interesting depth of field. Instead of going higher in the ratio, meaning 2, which squeezes it, I want to go lower towards 0, which stretches the depth of field. And I want to experiment with that because it just gives it a bit of a feel that like things are in motion compared to in this too, which kind of actually takes away from it. I also want to have this substation that I was talking about in the background, and I start modeling that out using the exact same techniques. While that happens, I'm going to do a bit of a shameless plug of the Patreon. If you're interested in the blend files of all the scenes I've made, including this one, or actual exclusive tutorials where I delve deeper into other specific things and just share random tips and techniques that I come up with sometimes. Or even just not even Blender, like my process of world creator. I did a breakdown about that recently, or character creation, or modeling, or just actual other scenes that I've made. If you're interested in something like that, please check it out. I would absolutely appreciate your support. Well, now that's out of the way. I add these lights to create more points of interest onto the buildings. Later on, we can just add an emission texture at the bottom so that they actually function as what they're supposed to. And after I model this, I obviously, loosely model it. And when you do that, you kind of have to clean it up afterwards as well, which I go and do. And to clean it up, you can just add some extra vertices where they're not. And you can just press X and just collapse them together, basically merging them. So instead now of having random n-gons, you end up with quads, which is generally considered better topology. But obviously it's a background asset of something that I'm never going to reuse, so I can be a bit sloppy with it as well. I wanted to have these pipes. You already might have seen in the intro, there's this interesting oily liquid. I'm going to show how I did the texturing of that as well, but I want that to be sucked into the main base. I kind of want to have a reason for the base to even exist. And these pipes serve the purpose of sucking that oil type liquid inside of the base to be processed and then shipped. And here I'm just further detailing by adding other things like booleans or just platforms. I add another sub building to the background building, and this one doesn't have to be detailed at all because it's barely going to be visible. You just have to add interesting enough silhouettes to give the illusion, and that's all. You don't need a lot of micro detailing. It's most about macro shape-based details that give the illusion that there's stuff happening. Like creating this railing, you just have a plane, you extrude up the edges, add some edge loops with Control R, and then you can add a wireframe modifier, and boom, you have a railing. And now you can just customize it and place it wherever you like. And for some assets, you don't even need to model them. You can get a lot of decent looking assets for free on Sketchfab, for example, like these radio towers. I download 2 of them and assemble them together, check out the materials, made adjustments if I have to, and then I start placing them in the main scene. And that's the fun of just creating a big asset library, which you'll see that you can just drag stuff out of and bash together to create some interesting shape. Like for example, this piece, it's definitely not usable for a railing, but in this context, it is if you just array it. Now I finally started around with detailing the actual landscape. And it's pretty simple. I can actually just import that landscape itself into World Creator and then just apply some degradation to it, like erosion, maybe some craters to give it a more realistic feel. And then I can just import it back into World Creator and then apply the materials using masks. I gave a pretty small breakdown in the previous video how I do that. And then here I just play around with the lighting a bit more and see how the mood is, and maybe I could change something about it. And I experiment with different, for example, HDRIs, but this HDRI is just perfect. The blue tintedness that it brings into the image, the light spill that it brings, it's just lovely. In my opinion, I love these kind of deep blue atmospheric shades, so I just stick with that. For the main cliff on the side, I just use some rock brushes. There's a lot of free rock brushes available. A lot of videos that offer, like for example this one here, and you can then just go into sculpt mode and just start sculpting with them, and it's very customizable and very fun to just put down some interesting shape. And I don't even need to have a super detail because it's going to be in the dark majority of the time. And after that I move on to more detailing, and for that I can use a lot of Quixel assets, a lot of these cliffs that I can just download, and then I can bring them into Blender and tweak them a little bit in terms of their material, because just by themselves they will be very out of place. But it just takes a little bit of tweaking of the saturation and the value of the albedo textures, and they fit right in. Now the next main thing after that, I want some kind of path leading up to the space station. For that I create a main texture as a factor and blend that in with a basic sand material and apply a displace modifier. And now we can just use this to drive the value of the displacement. And now I paint out the ground. First I made the mistake of just making one big wider path. That's what I'm kind of used to doing with a lot of the medieval style environments that I do, but here I kind of wanted a rower instead, so I go back and just make the paths narrower and make 2 of them and try to keep the distance between them kind of equal. and I like how that looks. The next thing I want to do is scatter rocks. These are just, again, some small few different kinds of rocks that I can use using the scatter on surface modifier that now comes with Blender 5.0. And I can just use an image texture to drive where I want them to be spawned. And I have two different layers of them, one of the bigger rocks and then the second of smaller rocks. That just helps create much more variety into our scene. Now to detail up the pipe, what I do is I get a detailed pipe asset. And now I'm going to create a curve modifier on it. And since we already have the curve placed down, I can just put an array modifier on top of it and set the value enough so that it reaches up until the end. And that's it for the pipe. Now for creating a sky, I get a nice image texture because I want a bit of a spacey look with a lot of stars. So for that, I can just get a, night sky picture with a lot of stars. And I can do the same for having a planet because it doesn't really feel sci-fi without like some kind of planet in the background. Since it's so far away, an image texture just helps you get away with it. If it was closer or kind of the focus, we would need to create an actual planet and that would take a while, but thankfully we don't need that. Now I start detailing things a bit more on the actual buildings, just adding some more railing assets and just arraying them into the scene, creating some tube lights, which is basically just a rectangle that I inset and apply an emission modifier. I do the same to these lights that I created before, and into the face that I inset inside, I gave an emission material. I use this add-on called Curve Basher to create some random wires. You just need to create multiple cubes, select all of them, and then just go to the curves option, and then it just spawns multiple wires that you can just play around with the value of, and it's just kind of fun. Next thing I want to do is add just a little bit more volumetrics into our scene, and doing that is simple. I use the same technique I used in our last thing that I showed, which is using these planes with a gradient texture. And with that, we can move on to something interesting. Now I'm going to show you how I created the oil texture. Creating it was fairly simple. I followed this tutorial. This was amazing, so thank you to this creator. I mostly followed exactly what they did until the end, and then I made just one tweak to it. And what they do is they have multiple noise textures, one with higher scale, one with lower scale, one with high detail, one with low detail. You put an add modifier to it and had a driver of just hash frame /500 is what I did because I wanted to displace pretty slowly, and now you see you have animation driven by the frame rate. Now the second thing is we can have this geometry node, use the normal input of that, plug it into linear light and blend them together and put that into a glossy shader. We already have something happening, and then the next thing you can do is create a hue saturation node, plug that into the color, and there we have it. Oil is done. The other thing they did is also adding an emission texture with the Fresnel node to mix them together, so now it's not that bright in different angles and it just shines in only specific areas, and I like that. That looks good. Now what I did is I just wanted a little bit of more darkness and a cute color variation around the edges, so it kind of feels like the oil's been kind of sitting there for a little bit more. So I created an ambient occlusion node with a color ramp, mixed those in together using a basic factor, and to give it a color I can just change the color material of the white into the color ramp, and there we have it. Now I'm gonna make it kind of desaturated and kind of dark, but I just kind of like that much more because it kind of, just gives that darkness to the edges that kind of blends it in. That ambient occlusion is kind of necessary for a lot of things in my opinion. And now I start placing it into our scene. Creating these rocky bits was also very simple. To do that, first I create a vertex group, just this one new vertex group. And then using the gradient tool, I just mark the top area. And now this vertex group drives the value of a displacement shader. And now you just displace the top bit. And it just looks a little more rocky, and I like that. After that, I use another gradient texture over here in the material section, and I'm gonna create two different parts of it, three, so that I can drive different values in materials. I kind of want the bottom to be similar to the main ground texture that we have, but the top to be kind of yellowish and then reddish at the top. Another thing I want to do to add more detail and interest to the scene is adding displacement to the ground. Just driving one of the displacement textures, just a basic image texture plugged into the displacement, just gives a lot more interest to the ground. It just looks far more detailed with these rocky bits just popping out. Like if I turn on cycles after I apply the displacement, like look at that, that just looks so beautiful in my opinion. I love when just the glossiness and the displacement just blends together this well and you get these little shiny bits. It just looks beautiful. I create this super strong area light to just test out how that would look, but I feel like it's a little too bright and takes away a lot more attention from the main scene. but we'll see how that comes in the end. I'm probably going to make some changes to it. But before doing that, I just kind of want to finish up the main buildings because they've been kind of sitting as blocky cubes. To do that, creating some very basic interesting shapes, and then I'm going to inset them to create a glass window like control panel at the top, so that you can imagine just people working here, maybe giving directions to the spaceships and coordinating just routes with them and supply chains, stuff like that, just the main control center. And then here at the bottom, I'm going to add a bunch more control loops by pressing Ctrl R, and then I am going to just select them and press double I to insert individual ones inside. Here I want to create just a few more different rooms, just like you could imagine them as being dedicated to specific certain tasks, and each room has its own purpose. And beside them is the storage unit. And the storage unit is the cylinder, and maybe the 3 panels on the side could just be the ones that calculate and manage the supply of the fluid that they're collecting from this planet. I just like to imagine kind of what the function of each thing that I build could be, just to serve as just immersion for myself into the scene. It's just kind of fun. Then I obviously bevel the edges to give a bit more of that sci-fi feel to the actual materials. I build a lot more storage units over here, and then I can just imagine them being beside the landing and taking off space where the spaceships land. They can just fill them up. It makes sense, just people doing their work, storage units, testing, R&D maybe. I also want just like a space to park like rovers where they would like either sit down them themselves or just like, and using a boolean I just cut into the building, so there's just an actual space here. And here, as I talked about, right beside the actual storage pod thingies, we have the landing and taking off bit. And I feel like if that's enough detail, we could now drive more detail out of texturing. And for texturing, I tried to texture most of the buildings with just one concrete texture. I kind of like the brutalist aesthetic a bit too much in my opinion, but like I love it, so I'm just going to use that to drive most of the texture. There's one concrete thing, and I start unwrapping individual bits and lining them up. As you can see, there's like individual lines that are in the texture coming out pretty linearly like across the buildings, and just unwrapping them and lining them up, manipulating the actual UV by unwrapping individual pieces and making them fit. This grime and the grunge bits and these little edges like aligning together, it's just really satisfying. For the control panel at the top, I bring in a glass texture and just reduce the roughness and bump up the metallicness a lot. And for now, I'm going to leave it at that, but we're going to add more things to that. I bring in this night picture of an office building, and I'm just going to selectively unwrap the bits where the windows should be, and we're going to drive that as the main windows, and just adds more interest than just them being black or just glossy or something. It just, this little nice little gradients that we get of just yellow light with darkness, it just looks really nice, especially contrasting with the blue dark night scene that we have. And I tried to fit that into every window logically where it would be. Texturing the top area, I also create this red concrete texture that's just literally changing the base color by mixing in just a multiply node and setting the color to red, and just giving different sizes and gradients to the different sizes of the pods, like red versus black. Maybe they store different kinds of fluids, and just adding the texture basically everywhere I can. And one of the last things I do is fog plane. Just moving fog planes, I add the pods that I was talking about, kind of just like automated machineries that just walk around, and that they probably created these paths that you see, and maybe some big rowers, but I don't think I'm going to model a big rower for this one, as I just want it to be a small practice scene. I do want to explore sci-fi a bit more in 2026 though. I want to create some bigger, grander scenes of maybe some sci-fi cities, maybe some planet shots, maybe even some large mega structures in space, but let me know what you think about that. For now, I get a spaceship from Sketchfab that is going to be flying out and in, as you saw in the opening animation. And here right now, I'm just trying to find just interesting angles for the scene so it doesn't look too boring. I keep the focal length pretty high, about 100. I bumped it up from 35 at the start, and this is for the animation only. For the still shots, I'm gonna keep 35. Now for the control tower, I also decided to add some lights, and again I'm using the same texture and driving that into the emission, and that's it. And I feel like personally that just adds a lot more to the control tower, adds more life. I also add a bit more of these steam bits. These are part of Ian Hubert's steam pack, and obviously because they are paid, I won't be including these specific bits into the file on Patreon, just like one or two of these bits that are like obviously paid won't be available on the Patreon, because that's just, you know, kind of disservice to the people who actually made these assets. So if you want them, I would recommend you check out their Patreons. But I just put them where, you know, I want some movement, some interest, especially at the ground, especially when the shape takes off. It would just look more interesting. And that's basically about it. I just figure out more different interesting angles. I animated the ship. I feel like the animation is a little too simplistic to even cover, because I feel like most people watching something like this already would know how to do that. Like the ship kind of just takes off at the start and just comes in. That's a very simple animation of just changing the location and rotation values. Going down could feel a little different, but no, it's generally not. For the smoke, I simulated smoke in Embergen, where the steam comes out and just goes. That just feels real fun to me. I'm gonna experiment with that further in the new next sci-fi scenes that I do. But for that, I did put in that simulation. I'm gonna provide that on the Patreon if you're interested for that steam simulation. It's not that hyper detailed, it's pretty light, doesn't take too long to render either. It's very good for medium shots of just steam blowing out of things. And now it's just finalizing the scenes, setting things up, making them look alright, and playing around with a little bit of compositing in DaVinci. And in the end, this was the final result. I hope you found it interesting. This is, as I said, just my first try at Sci-Fi Stuff, so I don't expect it to be grand. I don't expect it to be just like, you know, something out of this world. I probably wouldn't even use it as my ArtStation thing at all. Maybe I'll keep it up for a bit and take it down or something. But, you know, as I said, not saying this is something crazy or something, you know, like I consider other scenes that I've made far better than this one. But let me know your thoughts on that. And if you would like me to explore sci-fi stuff further and maybe even get better at it with more interesting shots, let me know. As always, I would really appreciate if you check out the Patreon. Thank you to the lovely Patreon subscribers already. I really appreciate the support, and I will be posting more stuff on the Patreon very, very soon. Thank you for watching, and if you made it till the end, maybe leave a spaceship in the comment at the end. Thank you very much.